The more research or the more investigation I do of behaviour, the more obsessed I become with context. And one of the reasons I become obsessed with it is it's patently clear that context affects our decision-making, not only to a huge degree, but to a far greater degree than we realise. Because context is so important, if you think about it in the sense of evolutionary psychology, that making decisions within context, in other words, deciding who to trust, for example, is such an important question to survival, and therefore is so old in the human brain that it's actually been effectively migrated to those parts of the brain which are effectively automatic. Now, the problem with those parts of the brain which are automatic is they're automatic, so we're not conscious of their workings. So we tend to underestimate the influence they have on decision-making. And Daniel Kahneman, who made this distinction in mental processes between system 1 and system 2, he admits this is a polite but useful fiction, that there are parts of the brain which are, if you like, very quick, effortless, automatic, and unconscious, and there are parts of our decision-making which are slower, deliberative, and conscious. And he calls those, respectively, System 1 and System 2. And when he was speaking at the Hay Festival about 3 or 4 years ago, someone in the audience, not me, I'm afraid, said, it's a very good question, asked him, is there a System 1 business? And he paused for a bit and said, yes, advertising, he said. And he paused for a bit longer and said, and politics. But actually, one of the things I've tried to do over the last few years with a division of Ogilvy called Ogilvy Change is to do exactly this, to create a System 1 business that understands those parts of the brain that people aren't, the operation of which people aren't really aware of, the bits that nobody will talk about in research because they're not even aware of the influence that they actually have on their behaviour. And as a result of this, I've become increasingly obsessed with this question of context. I think it's impossible actually to overstate the importance of it. But the whole aim, really what we have as a business is we say, look, there are certain jobs that advertising is given to solve. So a mixture of creativity and human insight and psychology is asked to solve a certain number of problems, but it's completely frozen out of any influence in most areas of decision-making. And I think this is actually a problem. What we're aiming to do is create an agency that gets money from things that aren't the marketing budget. So when someone comes in from the British Army to talk about conflict resolution, we count revenue from that kind of source double, if you see what I mean, because it's from a non-standard source. And my view is that agencies need to learn to do this. I'll give you an example of just a conversation I had. I'll give 2 tiny examples of the kind of work we do. Going to a call centre and finding out after 2 psychology graduates, average age about 24, go to a call centre and spend the morning listening to the calls. They then spend the afternoon suggesting tiny psychological changes to various parts of the script. For example, at one point in the call centre, it was for a publication subscription, funnily enough, you had to choose between option A, B, or C. And they simply said, if you ask them this question, they'll find it very difficult, but instinctively, human beings are a herd species. If you say, we find that most people choose B, but if you like, you can also have A or C, the number of people who drop out of the call at that point drops enormously. So 3 or 4 tiny clauses inserted into little bits of the call centre script actually more than doubled the conversion rate of that call centre. And so that's one of the other things which we're obsessed with. We have a slogan which is dare to be trivial. Because the mental model we tend to use for business is an engineering model. If you go to a management consultancy, most people there have an engineering background. Economics is really an engineering model. It looks at economies and markets as though they operate by the rules of Newtonian physics. And the simple truth is they don't. In fact, biologists, I would argue, complexity systems experts, have a much better understanding of markets. And one of the things that biologists understand is exactly this point, that the scale of the intervention is not proportionate to the scale of the effect. There are butterfly effects within marketing, tiny things you can do which have huge effects. There are also oblique interventions. One of the problems with engineering is you always assume a kind of Newtonian model where you push in the direction you want to travel. I went to a consulting firm just a few days ago and we were talking about the very real and current question of diversity. And I said, there's a very simple way you can make your employee base more diverse without imposing any ethnic or gender quotas at all. So hire people 5 at a time. Now, what's interesting is we understand this instinctively. If you think about it, everybody knows instinctively that if somebody with 4 cars does not buy 4 identical cars, right? You'd be pretty weird to do that. What you do when you buy 4 cars is you look for complementary strengths and weaknesses. You'll probably have a big off-road vehicle and a Mini, or a 2-seater sports car and something else. No one would buy 4 identical cars. And yet 4 individual people, each buying 1 car with a quarter of the budget, will probably buy 4 very similar cars. So simply by changing the architecture of choice, this is one of the most useful phrases to come out of behavioral economics, choice architecture, you will automatically get more diversity. And I made the point that in virtually every field, if you choose things in a different way, you make different choices. And you're therefore capable of increasing employment diversity and vastly increasing the variety of people you take on board, in a way that, by the way, the Ku Klux Klan couldn't object to this, politically, if you think about it, simply by changing the way you frame the question. And this is the thing that obsesses me now. I've come to the conclusion that marketing, very simple definition, is just the science of knowing what economists are wrong about. And to some extent, what management consultants who are deeply influenced by that kind of engineering mindset. That's our job as marketers, to know what economics is wrong about. And our job, in a sense, is to not... What's actually happened in marketing is we've become, effectively, we've got a kind of Stockholm syndrome to the finance function, where we're actually essentially... It's rather like people who've been held hostage. You suddenly start to take on the worst qualities of your abusers. And I think that's happened in marketing. I think marketing people are so obsessed with the need to justify themselves to finance that the idea that you might question some of the assumptions of finance never happens. And what's happened is the economic map and the finance map has just become over-dominant. I think the same thing has happened, by the way, in media. I think what you might call the reach map has become over-dominant. You know, the number of people. I would argue, actually, having spent 25 years in advertising, that most brands, in a sense, don't really have a target audience. They have a target context. I think, actually, who you sell to is probably less important, certainly in demographic terms, than the moments at which people are prepared to do something. And yet because our understanding of the human brain is actually quite bad, and because it sort of borrows from engineering, we tend to completely miss this fact. So just to give you an example, the tube map, just like economics, is quite a good map, okay? For the purposes of understanding, it abandons the idea of what you might call topographical accuracy. There are some absurdities. If you want to get from Paddington to Lancaster Gate, you're far better off walking. There are about 3 or 4 of those, where the ability to actually lose topographical accuracy creates distortions. But there's actually a problem with the tube map, and just as there's a problem with the standard media metrics, which is in a way they're quite good and they're quite useful. The problem happens when they start becoming used to the exclusion of anything else. And I'll point to this example with the tube map, okay? It's not a bad map of the bit of London north of the river. As a map of South London, it's absolutely useless. That's because in South London, you get around by train, and loads of North Londoners who basically see London through the tube map. There's a great phrase in philosophy, the map is not the territory. They go, well, I couldn't possibly move to South London because there's no tube there. There are only 3 million people live south of the river in London. It's getting on for as big as Madrid. But if you genuinely look at the South London tube map, you go, what a shitty little city. And this is the problem, that when one map becomes dominant, it's useful at first. It's like a sat-nav. It's quite useful at first. But if you start taking it literally, and actually, instead of becoming an aid to decision-making, it becomes a substitute for decision-making, that's when things start to go wrong. South London, actually, if you look at the property prices there, one of the reasons they're just markedly lower is because North Londoners go, well, I couldn't move there, it's nowhere near the tube. The fact is that South London is dominated by railways. There's a reason. There aren't any major cities south of London, so the railway companies, to make money, couldn't run trains to Manchester or Leeds or Edinburgh, so they basically had to make money from creating commuter railways. It's an economic reason, in a sense. Now, just to give you an example of how important this map becomes and how distorting, there's a thing here which kids call the ginger line, okay? It's actually technically called the overground. It existed as a railway for about 40 years. It used to be, anybody know this? It used to be called Silver Link Metro, okay? And nobody used it. I used it about 10 years ago. It was like Bad Day at Black Rock when you got off the train. And there was nobody there. Suddenly, they rebranded it the Overground, and they put it on the tube map, and usage more than doubled in the space of 6 months. Because until it was on the map, no one acknowledged it existed. And this is where all mental models are dangerous. They start off useful, and they start off as an aid to thinking, and they become a substitute for thinking. Now, understanding just a bit about human decision-making and how we really make decisions, what you have to understand is the brain is not really an information processing device in a conventional sense. It's an inference engine. Now, if you look at these footprints, okay, most of you, I think, will find that the ones on the left seem to be sort of convex and sticking out, and the ones on the right seem to be concave. Fair? Don't worry if you don't, it just means you're schizophrenic. No, not really. If I rotate it, in fact, I think we can rotate it now. Is that right? It's exactly the same. In fact, they're the same photograph, and they've just been comped together. What the hell's going on? Why do you see the ones on the left as being sticky outies and the ones on the left being indentations? Brain's making a punt. Basically, your brain is winging it, okay? And it goes, well, I need to make sense of this image, and clearly one of them's out and one of them's in. How the hell do I decide which? Well, it's more likely, statistically, that a light source is going to be coming from above than from below. So I'll make the assumption on convex concave based on the assumption that the sun's more likely to be above my head than below my feet. We don't know whether this is evolved behavior, an evolved distinction or a learned one. You could find out, but you'd have to keep babies in a cellar with a really bright floor for 4 years, and that would probably run up against some ethical objections. But this is the kind of way, here we are, rotate it again, it's exactly the same. The brain is basically making a punt. This is an example of an extraordinary subconscious influence. A wall clock, this is from a wonderful South African behavioral scientist. If you add a wall clock to a FedEx magazine ad, okay, nearly everybody reading the ad doesn't notice the clock, okay? Very few people are conscious of the thing. However, it's more than twice as likely to evoke the notion of speedy service than the same image without the clock. We're affected by things we don't notice. This is the fundamental problem of the brain, which is that we think, because our conscious brain likes to reassure ourselves that we do, we think we're actually deciding consciously. The conscious part of the brain, in fact, is kind of the Alistair Campbell of the brain. It thinks it's the Oval Office, but in reality it's mostly the press office. It's hastily cobbling together plausible-sounding post-rationalizations for decisions that have already been taken instinctively somewhere else. Paul Dolan and I, he's at the LSE, made a very naughty suggestion for this, which is when a man says, my wife doesn't understand me, it doesn't mean he's planning an affair, it means he's already had one. Okay? That effectively, the reasons and arguments that the brain comes up with are essentially post-rationalizations for past behavior. What actually happened is you got drunk and snogged someone at a party you didn't even like very much, and on the way home you go, well, I can't, this is deeply inconsistent behaviour. I know, I'll now construct an entirely bogus case against my wife in order to explain it. And the brain does a hell of a lot of this stuff. Now, why this is important, by the way, context, is explanation for how business works is very different if you accept the fact that people's preferences are not constant or transitive or anything like that. They're context dependent. Now, here are the two explanations of Tesco. There's the economist's behavior explanation for the fall off of Tesco sales, which you'll typically see on Sky Business News and all this kind of stuff, which is that, well, they were undercut by Lidl and Aldi and Netto and deep discounters, and they weren't price competitive, so people moved from Tesco to cheaper places. And all economists believe that, because they believe people have constant preferences, they know what they want first, and then they go and buy it as cheaply as possible. Now, the only problem with that explanation, it's very easy because it's plausible. It doesn't fit the facts at all because those brands have not grown nearly enough to explain the fall-off in Tesco sales. There's another explanation which involves complexity and context, which says Tesco, and competing brands as well, but particularly Tesco, opened tons and tons of smaller stores all over the place. Tesco Metro, then M&S stores started appearing at your local BP station. There were smaller Sainsbury's popping up here and there. This fundamentally changed the way that people shopped. And when you do 4 £25 shops, you don't shop in the same way as when you do one £120 shop. When you're doing a one huge shop, Okay, Tesco being in that mid-market position is the kind of sweet spot. If you're doing 5 different shops, remember no one buys 5 identical cars, got it? Okay? When you're doing 5 different shops, you do one bit of farmer's market, a little bit of Lidl, a bit of M&S, one trip to Tesco and one trip to Waitrose, or whatever. You mix. And the reason is that economists and the standard model assumes that people know what they want and then they go and buy it. Actually, people didn't do big shops because they wanted to do a big shop. They did big shops because that's what you do when the shop you're in happens to be big. Do you see what I mean? That you feel, if you go to one of those Tesco things that's the size of a Hindenburg hangar, right, on some ring road somewhere, which has actually got its own microclimate, it's so big, okay? You feel a bit of a prat coming out of that thing with a can of Vimto and a cheese sandwich, don't you? By the way, if you don't believe about context, one of the most important inventions in retail was the medium-sized trolley. When I was a kid, you had a basket or you had a massive trolley, right? Do you remember that? Anybody? No, you've got to be about 45, 50. You didn't have those shallow trolleys, okay? And so a hell of a lot of people chose a basket when they actually needed more than was in a basket. Because if you had the trolley, well, where I came from, made you look a bit Catholic, having this vast, great thing, okay? So someone ingeniously invented the medium-sized trolley. Now, the thing in the middle, it's called the Goldilocks effect, okay? That's the natural human default. So people went, well, I don't want one of those massive trolleys, but it's probably more than a basket. The medium-sized trolley converted people to trolleys without them being aware they were being converted. Now, here's more and more research about context. Grocery shoppers buy more if they're hungry. The likelihood of enrollment in a college campus depends on the weather when you visit. Order of presentation can change online ordering by a factor of 2.5. Here's a beautiful example of using context extraordinarily well in what I call dare to be trivial. Doctors, pretty intelligent people, okay, 30, 40 years, they'd all assume people come to them and say, I need antibiotics, doc, I'm feeling pretty ill, and they had 2 choices, they assumed. Yes, you can have some antibiotics, or no, you can't. Right? Both of those were problematic in a sense because they were over-prescribing antibiotics, but if you said no, people were pissed off. Only 4 years ago, there emerged, someone had the idea of a third option, which is you just had the delayed prescription. You said, here's a prescription for antibiotics which comes live on Friday. If you're still feeling ill in 3 days' time, go in and cash this in. And what people were failing to realize is the extent to which human beings behave according to context in any case. When you gave someone a prescription, they basically wanted to get home because they were feeling ill. But the GP surgery had a pharmacy right there. You paid £8.10 for your prescription and got the pills to take home. Once you paid £8.10 for something, you're going to use it. There was an existing inherent bias in favour of taking antibiotics. What this is actually doing is restoring reasonable decision-making. My other suggestion, if you want people to finish the antibiotics, don't give them 24 pills, 24 white pills, give them 20 white ones and 4 red ones, and just say, when you finish the white ones, take the red ones. Everybody will finish the whole thing. I don't know why. I can't explain this stuff. No. Just an example of how we choose. We're not even aware when the context's bad. This is the M20 leading to the M25 as you come back from Dover and Folkestone. Has anybody missed the turn off the M25? Because every audience I've been in, there's somebody there. Okay. Now, I even had someone in Johannesburg. Now, what was strange, I made this mistake 5 times coming back from Deal. And after the 5th time, I thought, actually, this isn't me, is it? There's something wrong. But I didn't know what it was. So I went to Google Street View, and I went back and forth. People laugh at this point, because it's a bit sad, okay? I went back and forth on the M20 as you approach the M25. This is how it works, okay? Terrible sign, because it doesn't tell you the distance to the junction, or anything like that. It mentions London on both sides, so it's more or less useless. But you go, I don't understand that sign at all, it's rubbish. But look, there's another sign coming up on the horizon, so I'll wait till I get to the second sign, and I'll make sense of this damn junction. Before you get to the second sign, this happens. So at the point you've actually got the information, it's too late to make a decision. So anybody who's missed that junction, I've written to them and tried to get it changed repeatedly. You either make an illegal swerve across the shaded area, or you basically shoot onto Orpington and have to double back, okay? When you go to a restaurant, there are massive contextual cues which encourage you to buy wine. I'm a skeptic here. I don't think wine's all that good a drink, okay? I think it's massively overrated. Who else agrees? Nobody. Come on. Okay, when is a glass of white wine better than a gin and tonic, really? Okay? It's like cheese. People buy French cheese to be pretentious. The reason the French have 250 kinds of cheese is because they've never managed to make one that's as good as cheddar. Okay? That's just how it works. Sorry, it's true. And we all know it's true, right? Okay? Now, just to prove a bit of context, you go into a restaurant, there are wine glasses all running on the table. You're handed a drinks list, but it isn't called the drinks list, it's called the wine list. And the wine list is 8 pages of an insane variety of wine, and then 1 back page for like the deviants and perverts who actually want to drink something that's been distilled or brewed, right? Now, even cleverer still, they don't hand everybody a drinks list or a wine list. They hand it to one person, and there's only one drink you can share. You can share between 4 or 6 people. So the second the guy with the wine list says to the table, red or white, it's game over for gin drinking, right? He's just closed you down. And then wait for it. The strangest thing of wine of all is that the staff can come in the middle of your meal and just fill up your glass. And you think that's them being helpful. No other alcoholic drink allows them to do this. They can't go and say, I've just brought you a couple of double whiskies, mate. Because you go, hold on a fucking second. I didn't ask for this. But if they top up your wine glass, that's fine, because that's service. Despite the fact that you're forced either to drink it or to leave it. I think it's a con, isn't it? But you allow this to happen because you're blind to context. Very quick exercises now. Hold up your 2 or 3 fingers in front of your eyes so you can't see the middle bit of this. What you'll then see, the whole brain works contextually. The top and bottom, although you think it's a grey bit and a white bit, they're actually the same shade of grey. Got that? Oh, sorry, I'll go back 1 more bit for the people who didn't get it. Once you put your actual fingers across, you'll see the top and bottom are exactly the same colour. But our brain is making a punt, basically, on what you're likely to see. Price, we perceive completely relatively. Nespresso, okay? If you had to buy Nespresso coffee in a jar, like Nescafe, a large jar would cost about 50 quid. And you look at that on the shelf and go, that's insane. There's no way I'm paying that. But it doesn't come in a jar. It comes in a little pod. And a single pod, we don't know what a single cup of Nescafe costs. The pod costs 29p, okay? So instead of thinking, Jesus, that's expensive, our frame of reference now is Starbucks, not Nescafe. So you go, well, it would have cost me £2.40 at bloody Starbucks. This machine's practically making me money. Okay? Right now, this is Robert Trivers, the evolutionary biologist. Basically, we have this naive view that evolution favours a perceptual system that gives us a more and more objective and realistic view of reality. And it's not in our evolutionary interests to perceive the world objectively. It's in our evolutionary interest to perceive the world in a way that's useful and that allows us to make quick, safe, non-catastrophic decisions. The non-catastrophic part's a really important one because when we talk in marketing, we always talk about what's good about a brand. The instinctive system 1 brain is overwhelmingly preoccupied with what might be terrible. And we never talk about that because we like words like sunny, bright, contemporary. The reason McDonald's is the most successful restaurant in the world isn't because it's fantastically good, it's because it's incredibly good at not being shit, okay? You're less likely to get ill at McDonald's than at a Michelin 3-star restaurant. You won't get ripped off, you won't be disappointed because the food is exactly the same. The absence of negatives is really important to us. We just never talk about it because, again, it's so important, it's instinctive. So I'll skip very quickly. Basically, we copy the behavior of other people. We instinctively follow the path, even though we don't know where the path is going, because lots of other people have walked that way. It's not the best way to go. We know it's probably not a disaster. You rarely get one of those going straight over a cliff, right? You'd have to be a major suicide black spot for that to happen, okay? We instinctively feel more comfortable going to a restaurant if there are a lot of people there because instinctively we're a social species and we draw reassurance from doing things that other people do. Really important in the dissemination of technology, by the way. We also understand signalling. The peacock's tail is effectively a way of saying to female peahens, I must be a pretty fit bird because I can carry this insane decorative burden around on my back which has no practical utility and still functions as a bird. Okay? It's basically luxury goods for animals. Okay? We understand things. This is actually, economists would not call that an engagement ring, they call it a commitment device. It's upfront expense, which is proof of long-term intention. Because if you bought one of those, you're probably in for more than a one-night stand, because it gets pretty expensive if you have to buy one of those every time. Now, instinctively, I don't think people bought engagement rings go, what a nice commitment device, because we understand these principles, and advertising works like that. It's upfront expense, which is proof, because it is costly, and I'm going to end on this point. This is the most important distinction which we genuinely don't know about. Right? Everybody assumes that digital must be better than print because it assumes that you can get the same message to people at a lower price. But what if the part of advertising that works is like the peacock's tail or the engagement ring, that it works because it is perceived to be expensive? Right? Why do we prefer brands? We prefer a brand because if a brand sells a bad product, it has a reputation at stake. It has something to lose from pissing us off. Do you see what I mean? That's the instinctive game theorist at work. Someone with a valuable reputation is less likely to sell a crap product than someone with no reputation at all or someone you've never heard of. It's a perfectly clever process, it's perfectly rational, it's just instinctive. In the same way, spending money on advertising is a bit like betting on a horse. If you've got a friend who owns a racehorse and they say, I think my horse is going to win on Saturday, and they just go around the pub saying that, that's pretty much meaningless because everybody says that. If they actually go to the bookies and bet £10,000 on the horse to win, that information now has a totally different character. Because the person now is subject to a possible loss from being wrong. And therefore, the information is more valuable. So that is my final point. I'll just end with a reading list. Any of these, pick a few at random. They're basically, how to think like a biologist, not like an economist. But that's my fundamental point. We have completely neglected to consider the fact that the reason advertising partly works is because it's perceived to be expensive. You might also argue that we perceive that advertising works because it's a promise made, like a wedding, in front of lots of people. When you get married, you don't go round to your friends one at a time making your vows. You make the promise simultaneously. Now, instinctively, we understand these differences. The difference between a costly communication, what in biology is called a costly signal. There's a whole area of costly signaling theory, okay? We instinctively understand that distinction. But the model I showed you at the beginning, the standard model of how many people did I reach with this message, doesn't understand that at all. And now, I might be wrong. All I'm saying is that if I'm right, there's some pretty terrible decisions being made in the media industry. Thanks very much indeed.